Hello, this is Dana with the 40th segment of the Master the Bible Today series, a snapshot of the book of Job. Job was written to demonstrate God's sovereignty, that he is the supreme authority and all things are under his control, and the meaning of true faith. It addresses the question, quote, why do the righteous sometimes suffer, unquote. Job is the first of the poetic books in the Hebrew Bible. Some believe this was the first book of the Bible to be written. In Job chapter 1, verses 6 and 7, and chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, it speaks about the angels coming to present themselves before the Lord God in heavenly councils or meetings. In these heavenly councils, God and the angels plan their activities on the earth, and angels are required to give an account of themselves. Satan, who in his pride had already rebelled against God, also must attend these meetings. From God and Satan's conversation in these passages, we learn a great deal about Satan. One, he is real and active on earth and accountable to God. God knew that Satan was intent on attacking Job. 2, Satan can only be in one place at a time. His demons aid him in his work, but as a created being, he is limited. 3, Satan cannot see into our minds or foretell the future. If he could, he would have known that Job would not break under pressure. 4, because Satan can do nothing without God's permission, God's people can overcome Satan's attacks through God's power. 5, God puts limitations on what Satan can do. This information about Satan should cause us to remain close to the one who is greater than Satan, God himself. Job was a prosperous farmer living in the land of Uz. He had thousands of sheep, camels, and other livestock, a large family, and many servants. Suddenly, Satan the accuser came before God claiming that Job was trusting God only because he was wealthy and everything was going well for him. And so the testing of Job's faith began. Through no fault of his own, Job lost his wealth, children, and health. Satan was allowed to destroy and attack all these things. It got so bad until Job's wife told him to curse God and die. But Job continued to trust in God. Satan attempted to drive a wedge between Job and God by getting Job to believe that God's governing of the world was not just and good. We must learn to recognize and not fear Satan's attacks, because Satan cannot exceed the limits that God sets. Do not let any experience drive a wedge between you and God. Although we cannot control how Satan may attack, we can always choose how we will respond when it happens. In challenging times, we need to go to God, not away from him. 3 of Job's friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, came to visit him. At first, they silently grieved with Job. But when they began to talk about the reasons for Job's tragedies, they told him that sin had caused his suffering. They told him to confess his sins and turn back to God. But Job maintained his innocence. For Job, the greatest trial was not the pain or the loss. It was not being able to understand why God allowed him to suffer. Suffering can be but it's not always a penalty for sin. In the same way, prosperity is not always a reward for being good. Those who love God are not exempt from troubles. Although we may not be able to understand fully the pain we experience, it can lead us to stronger faith and to rediscover God in a deeper way. A young man named Elihu, who had been listening to the entire conversation, entered the debate and criticized the three friends for being judgmental and unable to answer Job. Elihu said that although Job was a good man, he allowed himself to become proud, and God was punishing him in order to humble him. This answer was partially true, because suffering should and does purify our faith. But God is behind our comprehension. God is beyond our comprehension, and we cannot know why he sometimes allows each instance of suffering to come into our lives. Our part is simply to remain faithful. Although Elihu's argument also failed to convince Job of why God allowed him to suffer, it prepared the way for God to speak. Job's friends were certain that they were correct in their judgment of him, but God rebuked them for their pride and arrogance. Man's wisdom is always partial and temporary, so undue pride in our own conclusions is sin. We must be careful not to judge others who are suffering. We may be demonstrating the sin of pride. We must be cautious in maintaining the certainty of our own conclusions about how God treats us. In reality, only God knows exactly why things happen as they do, and we must submit to him as our sovereign. Finally, God spoke and answered Job out of a mighty storm with questions of his own. Read chapters 38 to 41 for God's mighty and informative response. God is in control of the world, and only he understands why the good are sometimes allowed to suffer. This only becomes clear to us when we see God for who he is. We must courageously accept what God allows to happen in our lives and remain fully committed to him. God is all-wise and all-powerful. His will is perfect, yet he does not always act in ways that we understand. Job's suffering does not make sense because everyone believed good people were supposed to prosper. When Job was at the point of despair, God spoke to him, showing him his great power and wisdom. Although God is present everywhere, at times he may seem far away. This may cause us to feel alone and to doubt his care for us. We should serve God for who he is, not what we feel. He is never insensitive to our suffering. Because God is sufficient, we must hold on to him. God alone knew the purpose behind Job's suffering, and yet he never explained it to Job. In spite of this, Job never gave up on God. Even in the midst of suffering, he never placed his hope in his experience, his wisdom, his friends, or his wealth. Job focused on God. Job showed the kind of trust we are to have. When everything is stripped away, we are to recognize that God is all we ever really had, have, or need. We should not demand that God explain everything. God gives us himself, but not all the details of his plans. We must remember that this life, with all its ups and downs, is not our final destiny. For Job, the drama ended with him being restored to happiness and wealth. It is easy to think that we have all the answers. In reality, only God knows exactly why things happen as they do, and we must submit to Him as our sovereign. As you read this book, emulate Job and decide to trust God no matter what happens. Thank you.